There is one very special place on our planet. Here, the usual reality breaks down, releasing a dramatic experience you will not find anywhere else. This is the Chernobyl exclusion zone. In this series, we summarize our 15 years of research in the zone based on on-site work and documents that often were never published before. There is a common belief that behind the barbed wire border of the Chernobyl zone lies some sort of completely uninhabited area where human will not last long. Well, it is completely true that there is a border, because the purpose of the zone itself is to be a buffer between normal life and the hazards contained inside. But keeping it safe for the world requires the constant work of thousands of people who are present there on a daily basis. And to understand how it works, we need to look at its recent history. It all started on April 26, 1986, after the explosion of Unit 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Since then, a lot has been said about the causes of this accident, but we will look at what happened next. It is important to remember that this was not a nuclear, but a steam explosion. It was followed by a massive burning of more than 1,000 tons of graphite, which once formed the active zone of the reactor. Starting from that moment, many very important events often took place at the same time, so we will need occasionally move back and forth in the timeline. And documents from that period provide insight into little-known details. One such document is an instruction on the regime of radiation safety dated 1983, which was reviewed just a few months before the 1986 disaster. It was signed by Nikolai Fomin, the chief engineer of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, who was later designated as one of the guilty parties. According to this document, there were two monitoring zones defined around the nuclear reactors, 10 and 30 kilometers, or 6.5 and 18.5 miles. At each radius were installed systems of radiation and meteorology sensors. It was also projected that in the case of hypothetical accident, contamination will not exceed the greater radius. So all existing pre-disaster protocols were based on that assumption. However, as it appeared, many assumptions were terribly wrong, because the nature of the 1986 accident was beyond any projections. Right after the explosion, a powerful ejection of dispersed fuel started from the destroyed reactor. The problem was that substantial amount of fuel turned into a fine dust and radioactive aerosols. So those were easily carried by wind and also by convection flows created by burning graphite. And at initial stage, the nuclides approximately matched those which appear in the reactor during this normal operation, but here they were enriched with volatile isotopes, such as iodine, tellurium, cesium and noble gases. The radionuclides differ greatly in their activity, transformation chains, lifetime and effects on humans. Among the initial ejection was iodine-131, which is exceptionally harmful to the human thyroid gland. Having a half-life of just 8 days, this means that this type of iodine disappears in roughly 1 month. And fast forward, this very first month in the zone was perhaps the most dangerous for everyone. However, 24 hours after the reactor explosion, the civilian population of nearby neighborhoods was still living their usual lives. Well, there were rumors spreading about some massive fire at the nuclear power plant, but no one could actually imagine that the reactor could be destroyed. A historical fact is that the entire approach of nuclear science in the USSR was based on the belief that this type of reactors could not have any problems. Spiced by Soviet ideology, this was drastically different from modern times, and eventually this system of ignorance gave it bitter fruits. Finally, on April 27, after long discussions, Moscow authorities permitted the evacuation of nearly 50,000 populated city of Pripyat. The thing is, the power plant was managed on the all-union level, so local authorities in Ukraine had no real power of this kind of decisions. Moreover, the entire scale of the disaster was yet unclear. A few years ago, the State Security Service of Ukraine declassified a few thousand documents which reflect the level of misunderstanding that existed in high offices. While communist authorities were deciding what to do, people were getting severely exposed, and for many, especially kids, that resulted in months in hospitals. I have to say, the evacuation has many dark spots behind it, so we will surely cover it in our future episodes as well. During the following days, up to May 2nd, 1986, the power of ejections from the reactor decreased due to makeshift attempts to stop the burning of graphite, which mainly included throwing lead, sand and dolomite from helicopters. As a side note, the efficiency of that move is quite questioned nowadays, but back then any solution seemed to be good. Only on May 2nd was a decision made to evacuate dozens of villages inside the 10-kilometer control radius. Since it happened a week after the accident, some villages were already so contaminated that later they were buried right on site. This day, May 2, 1986, is the birthday of the restricted zone. If you look at any access card issued in 1986, that is exactly what it says, for a restricted zone. But it was not yet the exclusion zone, because for a few following months, almost no one had the idea that this was forever. In the evening of that day, all of a sudden, the power of ejections rapidly increased. At that moment, the active zone of the reactor still had a temperature of roughly 700 degrees Celsius or roughly 3000 degrees Fahrenheit. This caused temperature-dependent migration of the fission products and chemical transformation of uranium oxide. As a result, there was a surge of aerosol ejections, and they continued to poison the ancient Polisia land. Between May 4 and May 7, villages of 30-kilometer radius, as well as the city of Chernobyl with a population of 14,700, were finally evacuated. It was hoped that this would be the final evacuation, but as you will see later, it was not the end. On May 6, 1986, the ejections started to rapidly decrease, but at that point, the usual-looking territory had become literally an uncharted land. Many of you know about the Chernobyl helicopters and the heroism of their pilots. What you likely do not know is that during that period, other, perhaps not less notable but no less important aircrafts appeared in the skies. These were airborne laboratories of the Soviet State Meteorology Center and Research Association Typhoon. They could see radiation in the most literal sense, and they created the crucially needed maps. And here you may ask a question: how it is possible to see radiation since it's actually invisible? Well, there is one special device for this, which is called gamma camera. It registers gamma emission and presents them over the image or a video feed as an overlay, so it is somewhat similar to a thermal camera. Nowadays, such devices are used in the zone of so-called hot chambers, where highly radioactive materials are manipulated in a safe way. Back in 1986, the equipment was of course not that sophisticated, and the images were low resolution and black and white, but that was better than nothing. The laboratories started to fly over Ukraine, Belarus and European part of Russia from April 29, 1986, and in total they made over hundreds of flights. The aggregated data was processed on special computers, and then the maps were created. And what was on those maps was truly dreadful. The 2 weeks of ejections formed 3 distinct flow tracks. During the initial period, the wind was blowing northeast, covering old villages like Krasno, Mashevo, Zimoviche and multiple neighborhoods in Belarus. That formed what later was named the North Contamination Track. But then the wind changed direction, forming the Western and Southern Contamination Tracks. This eventually defined the modern shape of the zone. At the same time, on the ground, multiple squads of dosimetrists were conducting surveys on radiation levels and nuclide concentration in the soil. It appeared that the fallout was not uniform and more resembled kind of a patchwork. This is because radiation is not a magic substance, there is always a physical source, no matter how small and invisible it might be. Different nuclides, being chemical elements, dissolve, filter and accumulate in different ways, so where they fell, spots and fields of radiation appeared. However, there was anyway some system to it. It appeared that most of heavy elements, such as plutonium and its descendants, were concentrated in the nearby power plant site, while lighter elements such as cesium, zirconium and ruthenium were spread much farther. At that moment, a large network of road checkpoints, decontamination points and monitoring facilities were established all around the disaster area. The purpose was to prevent spreading contamination via car wheels and cargo. Even to enter Kiev, which is approximately 100 miles away from the power plant, one needed to present a special permission. But this was not enough to prevent people from accessing dangerous land. First, a fence was built around Pripyat and one more around the most affected areas, with checkpoints near the villages of Koshivka, Leliv, Stechanka and Bovishe. As it roughly matched the 10-kilometer monitoring area, it got the name 10-kilometer zone. And for nearly 2 decades, to enter this subzone, you would need to change your clothes, and any vehicle picking you up would have the writing Zona in the circle. That indicated the vehicle could operate only inside this area. Fast forward, over the years, this internal perimeter became redundant, and the barbed wire fence fell down. In the forests close to the village of Korogod, it's still possible to see the remains of this fence with occasional rusty warning signs which say "No trespassing, restricted zone." At some internal checkpoints, distinct bunker-like buildings remained. Those once had thick windows made of yellow lead-lined glass, and they were equipped with air filters. More complex it was with external 30-kilometer perimeter, because it had to become a border with places of normal life. So miles and miles of barbed wire fence went through forests and swamps, but also neighborhoods. The actual criteria for determining its placement were the concentration of nuclides and the level of beta flux in each particular spot. Unfortunately, radioactive contamination didn't follow any administrative borders. So in some cases, one part of a village ended up inside the zone, while another part was outside. Exactly this happened to once large village of Hubin, which now is nearly a ghost town. In some places, like Dityatki village, the barbed wire had to go through the middle of the central street. And only informal negotiations between local authorities and the Soviet Ministry of Defense pushed it back to the north, preventing the creation of this strange nuclear version of the Berlin Wall. Eventually, the fence went through the villages of Dibrova, Terekhy, Stary Sokoly, Andriivka, Dityatki, Hubin and Strakholissia. Among them, Dibrova, Stary Sokoly, Dityatki and Strakholissia remained outside, so permanent checkpoints were created at those villages. Moreover, a bit later in Strakholissia, the so-called Green Cape, an entire town for liquidators, was later established, which lasted up to 1998. Speaking about the checkpoints, actually there is pretty much interesting about them. So, if you ever have visited the Chernobyl zone, you likely passed through the Dityatki checkpoint, and probably you remember how huge it is. What you likely do not know is that what you see there now is very little compared to what was initially built at that place. There is a document which is called Experience of the Civil Defense of the Ukrainian SSR during the elimination of the Chernobyl disaster. And in that document you can see the original plans. So, apart from the checkpoint structure itself, they were built rotary washers for cars, showers for staff, and even a small hotel. However, by memories of locals, perhaps the most impressive part of the newly built checkpoint was a giant gantry crane. That crane reloaded the endless flow of cargo from clean vehicles from outside of the zone to those designated to work inside the zone to eventually remain there forever. This massive infrastructure remained in operation roughly up to 1997. At that time, radiation levels already pretty much decreased, so all that was no longer needed and a new reconstruction was made. Similar but smaller facilities were also created at Starisakoli and in Dibrova, where also was a crane, but a taller one. And here you may ask a logical question. So if you look at the map, Dibrova is deeply inside the modern zone, so after all, why was this checkpoint needed? The reason is, in a few years, the zone continued to consume the lands around, and as you will see, the reasons behind were really creepy. In 1986, however, the first sampling proved that most of contamination was concentrated in literally a few millimeters of upper level of the soil. There was still no exact understanding of how deep it will migrate. So this gave a hope that there would be possible to clean it all up, and massive works started. Those efforts were generally quite experimental, as such challenges were never have been faced before, so that led to many techniques being invented right at the place. And although Soviet media through 1986 were sharing stories declaring that there will be a return to Pripyat and to other places, the truth was way more bitter. Because while some methods of decontamination were actually quite successful, it gradually became clear that this story would be a long one, and a normal life will not return to some places. Just if you take cesium-137, which is one of the few main dose-forming elements, by 1987 it was already migrated about 6 centimeters, or 2 inches deep, and that process continued with most of radionuclides. In this way, what was inside the inner perimeter became an exclusion zone, when all the balance cost of all possessions became void. Perhaps the final blow to hopes of returning to Pripyat was the start of the construction of the city of Slavutych as a replacement, which began in October 1986. In November 1986, the construction of the sarcophagus over the damaged Unit 4 was completed. This event marked the end of the active stage of disaster elimination. But the zone could not be left unattended, so this big work continued, and elimination of the consequences is ongoing even today. By the end of 1986, a special state production association led by scientist Yevgeny Ignatenko was established. Following the best Soviet traditions, it got a maximally ambiguous name Kombinat, which means literally combined production. But hidden behind that name was a giant enterprise which managed everything in the zone, which means literally that Pripyat and everything inside the zone, including even the Chernobyl nuclear power plant itself, fell under Kombinat's jurisdiction, creating a unique afterlife for these lands. Shortly in late 1986, with modernized Units 1 and 2, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant resumed operations as energy-generating facility. After its third unit was put back in operation in 1987, the power plant could generate enough heat to restore normal operations in Pripyat. So in 1987, Pripyat began operating as a laboratory and research city for over a decade. And during initial years, its employees even lived in dormitories right in the city. Chernobyl city, which is located 12 kilometers or roughly 8 miles from the power plant, also got a new life and effectively became the capital of the zone, housing offices and enterprises. Fast forward, after the closure of the Green Cape camp in Strakholissia, Chernobyl became home to zone staff. For other lands, in the 80s, the Soviet authorities continued their lies. For example, there is this map of the Kiev region that shows the exclusion zone, and the outer area is marked as a place of temporary evacuation. This map was completely public and you could buy it in any shop, but the grim detail is that this map was published in 1989, a year after a massive survey was conducted regarding the possibilities of return. That survey stated that there was a theoretical chance to exclude from the zone just 14 villages located closest to its southern border. But that never happened. And here I have to remind you about that question about the lands located west of Dibrova. So, if you look at the map of contamination, we will see a powerful spot around village of Varovichi. So, 5 years passed after the Chernobyl disaster, but people still continued to live here, and those who tried to move away were often blamed as panic makers. Only when Soviet Union collapsed in 1992, the government of Ukraine could make a decision of permanent evacuation of these lands. This led to creation of a new subzone, officially called as a Zone of Obligatory or Unconditional Resettlement. At some point, this zone included the old town of Poliske, located 52 kilometers or 31 miles away from the damaged reactor. Poliske is somewhat similar to the city of Chernobyl, but it is relatively little known. It has a similar age, over 800 years, and is built with private houses along with some larger buildings in its center. What is different about Poliske is that after 1986 it became a place where many people, including those from Pripyat, were resettled permanently. They got apartments and new infrastructure was built in the town, and all that was for nothing. However, the influence of the zone extends far beyond its physical borders, and to the west of the zone of unconditional resettlement there are dozens of deserted villages which belong to the zone of voluntary resettlement. And even where it is permitted to live, for example here, the zone is still significantly shaping the way of life. I mean, while right next to the border of the zone you already can legally and practically live normal life, the area is under enforced radiological control. Given its rural nature, strict regulations dictate what crops are safe to cultivate or, for example, what can be collected from the forests, and so on. In addition, local residents are advised to undergo annual body spectrometry to measure how much cesium do they have in a body. With the addition of Poliske, the Chernobyl zone reached its current size as we know it now. A production association Kombinat ceased operation in 1990. It was succeeded by Scientific Production Association Pripyat, which managed everything in the zone until 1998. Later, after many reorganizations and changes, the zone came under the management of the State Agency of Ukraine for the Exclusion Zone Management. In addition, there are numerous special enterprises, which are partly based inside the zone and partly outside. For example, the state-specialized enterprise Chernobyl nuclear power plant ended production of energy in 2000, and now it focuses on decommissioning the facilities of the damaged power plant. The Central Enterprise for Radioactive Waste Management handles decontamination and operates radioactive waste burials and storages. The Special Enterprise Eco Center monitors radiation conditions, ensures safety and operates a state-of-the-art central analytics laboratory for radioactive materials. Although the inner 10-kilometer zone no longer has a physical fence, it is legally designated for the treatment of radioactive materials, maintaining strict regulatory activities. The outer 30-kilometer zone serves as a buffer, and its biggest part is the Chernobyl Biosphere Reserve. The reserve features a remarkable restoration of flora and fauna, and many species you can find here are in the red list. Well, this was just a very brief overview. There are many more organizations and individuals involved, and we will talk about that in our future episodes. From its inception, the zone has never been abandoned. It has become a unique scientific laboratory, a natural sanctuary, and a place of daily heroism for thousands of people. After all, it is so unique that it feels like a separate world, kind of an island with its own rules. Those who work here share this sentiment and refer to the lands outside as a great land. Today we have just a little bit scratched the surface of this incredible story, because it is too large even for a few videos. So, in our next episodes, we'll explore the virtually unknown history of these lands, explore the unrealized projects of the power plant and Pripyat, discuss the pre-disaster life in Pripyat and the region and its post-Chernobyl existence. And for those of you who want much more, check our Patreon page. There you can find translations of unique documents, various archived data and insights into Chernobyl as a daily life. The link is in the description below. And now, thank you for watching and see you next time.